All right, there we are. Hey, we are off the cuff, a few minutes late from scheduled time. No end to the crazy, wild things that technology will do to us sometimes. But yeah, feel free to jump in, comments below. I know we've got people on Facebook and YouTube and even Twitter's Periscope. I will say we are having, I don't know, sometimes on Facebook, I'm not seeing all of your comments. Some of those seem to come through sometimes on certain like on my page for the More Than Cake page or the Center for Cultural Apologetics page, but sometimes not on my personal profile where this is also going live as well. So sorry about. I'm not sure. I'm trying to work with the people that build this software to see what we can do, but I'm not sure I have much more control over that. But I am going to try to get to your comments, and I will even show them when I see them. If you want to guarantee that you get your comments seen, you might want to switch over to my YouTube channel. It's just you can find it at jrmiller777. Is the address at the end of the YouTube thing. I should be there as well. But anyway, that's just a little bit of show notes. But hey, I have a great guest today. His name is Mark Perez. And Mark Perez is actually one of the author's contributors to a book that we're going to be looking at. And you can see it there. I'm actually holding it up here as well. And I talked to one of the other authors last month, Fuzz Rana, but this is thinking about evolution. And we're going to look at his chapter, which is on some fallacies, some logical fallacies. Now, Mark Perez, he holds a BA in philosophy and MA in philosophy of science and has been teaching critical thinking to university students, public sector employees, and others for over 20 years. Among other things, he's interested in helping people of all viewpoints think more carefully to find truth and avoid erroneous reasoning, which I would say actually is a pretty important thing these days in a lot of fields, not just in Christian apologetics. So, Mark, welcome to the show. Hopefully, hey, it's good to actually hear you.
Yeah, it worked.
We had our
loud that tin can worked.
I know we had our challenges, but I'm glad that we are finally working on there. So, hey, why don't you just give, I gave, obviously you heard me give a little bit about your background. You sent me the bio, but maybe tell folks a little bit about your interest in writing this chapter of the book and how that came to be. What's your background specifically in this kind of topic of looking at fallacies and logic?
Well, the chapter arose from some conversations I had with the other authors, particularly AJ and Fuzz, about some of the popular presentations of evolution. And I had mentioned that in the literature that I'd seen over the years, I'd been working in apologetics. I say working, I mean being a lay apologist for several decades. And I'd noticed, particularly in the popular media, in the popular presentations of the theory of evolution, that there were some really crazy things being said, and they ended up being very clearly fallacies, informal fallacies. Not all of them were logical fallacies. And so when the book was being considered and they were thinking about it, I was spending a day per week over at Reasons to Believe headquarters and talking with them and doing other things. And they said, well, would you like to write a chapter on some of those fallacies that you've seen? And I said, yeah, that would be fine. We need to make sure that we know that the presentation of the theory of evolution isn't always exactly scientific, but neither is creation theory. So that's the genesis of that chapter and why that chapter ended up in a book that's principally a book about science.
Yeah. Now you did some other work before this too. I mean, with I guess with police investigations or some other things like that. I think I read on your longer bio.
Oh yeah. Well, my entire career spans about 40 years, and a lot of that 40 years was in law enforcement. And I started out as a police officer and ended up as a deputy chief of police of Los Angeles Police Department.
Oh, wow.
And what's interesting about that career is that I acquired my education while I was working as a police officer and going through there. And it was actually while I was a police officer that I became a Christian. And so there are many things that I did. I had, as I went through the ranks, I had many different kinds of assignments. But I ended up teaching critical thinking in policing, and ended up teaching actually some of it down there in San Diego
Oh, wow.
to the California Peace Officer Standards and Training. So that and some other places, uh, I applied critical thinking, and knowing informal fallacies is just part of it, but it's a big part of it. If you don't know what informal fallacies are and you can't detect them, then it's very easy to let them slide right past you and to distort your thinking,
Mm,
whether
yeah.
you're making the fallacies yourself or someone else is presenting them.
So what I
So
hear you
that,
saying is, I was gonna say, so what I hear you saying is when you're doing policing work, sometimes people would tell you things that are not true, and you had to figure that out. That might be shock. I just want to go slower here, so I'm not losing anybody early on.
no, that's actually not how it works.
No, that's not how it
The,
works. Okay.
no, detecting lies is different from detecting fallacies.
Okay. So,
So
well,
the
that's
fallacy
okay. Well,
is,
then help us with that. Explain what a fallacy is, and what you know. So when you talk about finding a fallacy, what is that?
a fallacy is an error in reasoning. And it's not necessarily a false statement. It's just an error in reasoning that looks like it's not an error, but it tends to be persuasive. And some people will use the term fallacy to represent something that's false. They'll say, somebody will utter a claim and someone will say, well, that's a fallacy, that's false. That's really
Mhm.
not what we're talking about here. We're talking about errors in reasoning that distract people from the relevant material that is being. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about informal fallacies. There are we best not to do it because it's very technical, and it
Mhm.
really isn't practical, formal symbolic logic, and what are the rules. And here, what is practical though is being presented to you, claims that are being made, and that's the key to detecting. That's exactly where a fallacy goes astray.
Yeah.
It misleads us.
Yeah. So you've had a lot of experience. You have a lot of background. You used to teach this stuff. Is detecting these fallacies, is that something you think, because everyone watching here is thinking, okay, maybe this is something for a specialist like yourself, or something who has a certain, degree, or went to, did their masters in some sort of philosophy or apologetics, those sorts of things, that has some deep insight. Or is this really something that everybody listening should feel like, hey, I want to understand this more? I mean, explain a little bit about why, is this something, again, everybody can do or not, do you think?
Yes, it is. This is understanding fallacies, identifying them, learning what they are, et cetera, is very accessible. It's very easy to do. And the way I know that's true is that many of the people who I've taught and who I've shown this to have immediately said, oh, I wish I would have known this 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I get it. So as people learn about fallacies and learn how they're used, they're very easy to spot, and you do not need a specialty degree. Somebody with a high school education or even not finishing high school could learn about fallacies, and they're all over the internet. If you just look up fallacies on the internet, you'll see dozens and dozens of them, and they're very easy to memorize, and they're very easy to understand. At least most of them are.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's good. Let's look. So let's dig a little bit into some examples and some things that you've come across here. So when it comes to Christians making arguments in favor of creation, which is, this book's about essentially a progressive creationist, old Earth creationist approach to understanding the science. That's what the most of the content is about. So we'll kind of stick with that theme around the creation, because I know that a lot of the examples in your chapter deal with that. But let's pick on Christians for a while. Since so folks just don't think it's only non-believers that we're talking about who make these fallacies. But when Christians are making arguments, say in favor of a creationist viewpoint, whether it be old Earth, young Earth, intelligent design, whatever they categorize themselves in. What are some of the common fallacies you've seen people make, or some of the mistakes they make when they're making a defense of that creationist view?
I'm very glad that you brought up the question of Christians doing it. I've spent many years looking at how Christians make those presentations. They're every bit as bad as anybody else who's not a Christian. So this is an equal opportunity error. So one of the things that I've seen occur frequently, and it occurs over and over, and it seems to go almost ubiquitously in certain circles, is a particular fallacy called ad hominem, or an attack against the person. And it looks like something like this. So, you atheists, like Dawkins or others, are very strident, and they'll make some really nasty comments. And so the Christians will say, well, so look what kind of a guy this is. I mean, who would believe that? I mean, it's obvious that atheism is wrong with people like that. So it's just a personal attack. I've even seen personal attacks within Christendom. You have some people, for example, have critiqued old Earth creationists and said that they're compromisers. That's not an attack on the belief, that's an attack on the person. And if there's going to be a dispute about how a Bible should be interpreted, or how one particular creation theory should be compared scientifically with another, they should be entirely scientific, not using terms like compromiser, or someone who's compromising the scripture in order to present a case.
Yeah.
And that's probably the one that bothers me the most, because it's the least effective in terms of winning an argument. All you do is create strife. What's the benefit of that? There is none.
Yeah, I think probably the other common one would too, it's a little different than the ad hominem, but it does relate to people. It's sort of that appeal to authority, where people say, I actually just had this the other day. Somebody said, well, my position is just like this person's position, therefore sort of that should end the debate. This person's on my side. The appeal to authority of it's sort of the ad hominem in a positive way, I guess, if people want to think of it that way. But I don't know. I guess I run across that a lot too, in some theology, just in theology in general, but also in maybe the creation debate as well. I don't know if you run across that.
That definitely is a fallacy. There actually is a fallacy titled appeal to authority, and it's an appeal to unqualified authority, and that's really what it is. So if I'm appealing to somebody, for example, who isn't an expert in a particular field, but I'm using them as my authority to grant me a particular position, that's one error. That's one form of it. The other one is an appeal to authority. The way you're talking about it there is to use them as a reference, as if that is a conclusion to the case. In other words, by appealing to that authority has so much knowledge that what they're saying cannot be false. And the reason that that's a fallacy is that the person's claim, if the person's claim is identical with yours, all you've done is repeated your claim. You haven't proved your claim.
Yeah.
And really what you're going to find in fallacies is that fallacies are means by which you introduce something that's irrelevant, that's not evidence, into an argument. And when you do that, then you're no longer arguing your position. You're bringing in something that's a side issue that doesn't grant you any kind of epistemological warrant at all. You have no reason to claim that your position is truer because you've appealed to this irrelevant reasoning.
Yeah. No, that's a really important one. I see that all the time. I had people determining what is truth based on which people align on which column of, this person is, and we see it in politics too. I mean, I think that's what part of the thing you're saying here is why it's so relevant. We're talking about the context of creation or evolution and those sorts of debates in science, but clearly, these kind of fallacies happen in political debates. They happen in any other topic you name where people have disagreements. These kind of fallacies can crop up for sure. So when it comes to say Christians. I'll stick picking on Christians for a few minutes, making arguments. Now, let's say they're making arguments in favor of specifically animal to human evolution. The idea that humans evolved from ape ancestors. So not defending creation, but defending that sort of evolution. Are there any kind of common fallacies you see or common appeals that people make that seem to crop up on a regular basis?
Well, one of them is what I would call circular reasoning, or well, that's the best way to call it. Is a circular reasoning, is question begging, and for example, if you look at the claim that homology, similar types of body parts show evolution, it's very difficult to use that as an argument without ending up arguing in a circle. And it goes something like this. So if I say the fins of a fish look like the hands of a person, of a human being, and fish evolved into humans, and there's all these transitions that show these finger-like things on their limbs. Therefore, this is evidence of evolution. Well, how do you know that's evidence of evolution? How do you know these aren't just independent? Well, because that's the way evolution works. Really? So that's your argument? That's arguing in a circle. That's trivially true. That you're saying that this is proof because that's how it works. Well, how do you know it works that way? Because this is the way it came out. That is literally arguing in a circle. And you'll see a lot of that. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or you're an evolution theorist. That kind of question begging occurs very often. And the problem is sometimes it's hard to distinguish that from actual reliance on a theory. But it is something that you need to pay attention to. Is someone arguing in a circle, begging the question, or are they using evidence independent of the theory to prove the theory?
Yeah. No, that's really important. You definitely see that sort of thing happening, I think, in a lot of contexts. And it can be, and I think your reminder is really important there for people to recognize. This isn't about, us versus them in terms of picking out fallacies. Christians make these errors. Christians in defense of even people making a defense of the right things that I might agree with, they can make these fallacies. And that's really painful, because then it kind of looks bad on, say, our side if we're both advocating for the same thing, but they try to make their case using a fallacy, then it diminishes the impact or the potential ability of somebody to believe that what they're saying is true, because they're using really bad methodologies, or in this case, employing fallacies to try to make that argument. So
yeah, it does. And one of the things that bothers me, because I really love science, and the reason I love science is that ultimately the facts that we observe are extensions of our senses. So if we get an astronomical observation or a microscopic observation, it's an extension of our senses. And Romans 1:19 tells us that we're accountable to know the nature of God by what we see in the world. And so science is a wonderful way of seeing more and learning more about God. And when I see people attacking science or scientists misusing what they're doing, making fallacious claims, for example, it bothers me because it's taking away from the real truth, which is, let's see what science is teaching us, not their conclusions. Let's see what the data is doing. Why? Because now we can evaluate the different positions honestly. And that's really where detecting fallacies becomes so important. Because once you're detecting the fallacies, what you're doing is you're seeing the errors in the reasoning. And then as soon as you see those errors, you can remove them. And it's like taking a shade away from a window. Then you can look in the window and say, oh, that's what we're talking about. Let's really argue this instead of some other irrelevant thing. Let's not cloud the issue. And one of them that I see that I think is particularly harmful is the what I would call the slippery slope argument or fallacy that arises from the God of the gaps argument.
Yeah,
The
let's
God of
get
the
it.
gaps
Let's get into a
argument
couple
is
of those. Yeah, I was. Oh, let me.
okay.
Sorry, to interrupt. I was saying, yeah, let's get into a couple examples from the book, and that's a great one to jump in on. So yeah, define some of those terms: the slippery slope, God of the gaps, and maybe give
Sure.
us some examples of where they'll come up. That'd be great.
A slippery slope argument is an argument that predicts that something bad is going to happen from a particular event, yet it doesn't show the causal relationships that are going to lead to that. So a slippery slope argument, for example, that we've seen in the God of the gaps argument is this: that if we allow God to be an explanation for something like the origin of life, then we're going to insert God as an explanation for all sorts of difficult things, all sorts of right now intractable problems. And if we do that, it's going to ultimately ruin science. So we can't allow God to be an explanation. God of the gaps is just pernicious. Well, that's a fallacy, because really what's happening in the argument of origins, and I'm talking about origin in particular, there are no scientists that I know who are also Christians who are asserting that you need to insert God as an explanation for every difficult scientific problem. But there are some who are saying there are some problems that are so difficult and they're all circling around origins. So these are problems that you can't repeat. In other words, there's certain things you can stick in a test tube, there's other things you can look at repeatedly, but an origin only happens one time. And so an origin problem is unique. When we say that, for example, the God is a reasonable explanation or the best explanation for the origin of life, for example, that's not unscientific. What it does is it's looking at the evidence and asking, if it were true that God existed, would we expect this origin to occur as it seems to have occurred? So that's a unique position, it's a unique situation, and it's a unique time when you would use God as an explanation only, only because there doesn't seem to be any other way of looking at it. That the origin problem is so difficult and appears to be beyond intractable that, in fact, there are maybe chemical problems, chemical biological problems that that'll never be solved because they cannot be. And
Mhm.
so at that point, you have to ask yourself, what is the state of the evidence at this time? And given the state of the evidence, a theistic argument from the origin of life is just as plausible as a non-theistic. So there we're looking at, we don't have to go to wiping out all of science by making that particular argument. The same would be true of the origin of humanity. The same would be true with both of the big explosions in biology, the Avalon and the Cambrian explosions, where suddenly these creatures show up in the fossil record with no antecedents and without precedents. How do you explain that? Why would you look at that and not see that God could be an explanation for that, especially given that there are other things that theism gives explanations for that science can't?
Yeah.
So that's a slippery slope argument that comes from the God of the gaps argument that we have to really be careful of, because whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, you need to realize that scientists who are Christians aren't going to stick God in every difficult problem.
Yeah. So maybe you can give an example of what would it look like for what you're saying to say, okay, making an appeal. Okay, God did this. God designed. Not every appeal to God is a logical fallacy, is what you're saying. And but an improper appeal would be called God of the gaps. Maybe can you give an example of what that would sound like, or what that looks like when somebody makes that kind of a fallacy in their argument?
I'm not sure what you're
If
saying there. You're
somebody's
saying,
making a God of the gaps, if somebody's making a God of the gaps argument, if they're committing that fallacy, what does that look like? How does somebody tell the difference between a God of the gaps, fallacy versus a legitimate appeal to God as designer?
okay, so a legitimate appeal to God as a designer would mean they're really two different kinds of things. So the fallacy of God of the gaps is the claim that God will be inserted into places in the difficult scientific challenges, even when he shouldn't be. So that's really the God of the gaps argument. And the fallacy there is that the Christians who are scientists don't want to do that because it's contrary to their interests. Why is it contrary to their interests? Well, because they really want to know who God is and what he is like. So they look at nature. Remember when I talked earlier about instruments being extensions of our senses and helping us deepen our appreciation for God and understanding our obligation to love him and know him, as Romans 1:19 talks about. So when can you use a theistic argument? I think that's where you were headed us on the other side. Was that the
Yeah,
other part
yeah,
of the
yeah.
comment?
So yeah, when is it valid to use God then? Maybe give somebody an example of a valid appeal to God.
Sure. Well, let's look, for example, at the fossil record. So the question is, when you're looking at something and asking whether uh, something is plausible, you have to ask what are other theories. So any number of facts, you can accumulate any number of facts, and you can create any number of theories. Um, it's known as the facts underdetermined theories. And so if you have the fossil record, you can look at it two ways. You can say, all right, there are some pretty huge leaps between these different kinds of fossils. I can look at it on one side and say, well, that's because of common descent. Or I can go to the other side and say, you know what, this is completely consistent with the biblical description of how life was created. So if I have a biblical description that conforms to the facts, I now have to be asked, is the weight of the evidence greater for one or the other? At that point, you have to start looking at the corollary arguments and some of the other facts that could be mustered. But the bottom line is, in that case, you have the same identical evidence with two different theories that can use that evidence and consistent with them. So consistent with creation theory as well as evolution theory. So that's one case where the God of the gaps, it isn't a real threat because the theory actually fits the model. It's not just an appeal to God to explain the unexplainable. It fits the model, just the
Yeah.
same way that
So
the
so
theory
in
of
other
evolution
words,
does.
yeah. So what people can need to realize is what you're saying is if you're making an appeal to God, and that appeal fits, logically coheres, it fits within the framework of the argument that you're making, then it's good. But if you're making an appeal to God to rescue a bad argument, then that would essentially be sort of a God of the gaps type argument, right?
Well, certainly it would have to be coherent, and it would certainly have to be consistent with the evidence.
Yeah.
The important thing is it consistent with the evidence in a way that can be weighed?
Hmm.
So you remember that really the whole question of whether creation theory is true or evolution theory is true is the weight of the evidence. Given the state of the evidence today, which one of those two theories best explains the data that we see in the record?
Yeah.
Given that, there's no God of the gaps in there. It's now an assessment of the two theories given the same evidence.
Yeah. So, I think, we've used the word evolution and creation and those sorts of things a bunch, but that brings up one of the other elements you mentioned in the chapter, one of the other fallacies. You call it the equivocal evolution fallacy. So maybe you can tell people what that is, the equivocal evolution fallacy, and what that is and how to spot that one.
Yes, that comes up very, very often. It's really surprising how often it occurs. So the fallacy's
Hmm.
name is equivocation. And equivocation just means that you're using one word that has several meanings in a way that's ambiguous or unclear. The way it actually plays out in some of the presentations on evolution in popular press, you'll see this a lot on television or YouTube videos. It works like this. They'll say, well, evolution is a fact, and then they'll start talking about how the microbes change and can become resistant to antibiotics, or that there are changes to species in the wild, etc. No one's disputing that. The the problem here is that there are at least three different definitions of evolution. And if you don't qualify which one of those you're using, you could be misleading people and creating a firestorm that you don't have to. So for example, evolution can mean merely change through time. That's one definition. Who's going to argue with that? Nobody is. There are things that change through time. They don't have to be biological. They can be physical. Just look in the mirror. We all change through time. The other one is the change in species, for example, or a population over time. So, for example, let's talk about adaptation. Is it true that species adapt and therefore change? Do they evolve with changes in the environment? Well, in that respect, that confinement, in other words, they don't become totally new creatures, they just become different within their own type. That's another form of evolution that's undisputed. There are no Christians who are also scientists who are saying that doesn't occur. They clearly agree with that form of evolution, which is sometimes called microevolution. Mm-hmm. But then when you get into the third definition, which I would call LUCA, or last universal common ancestor evolution, that is evolution that is defined as the descent of all creatures from one last universal common ancestor. There's common descent that all of life on Earth, the entire biohistory derives from one or more universal common ancestors. Well, calling that a fact is not a legitimate claim. And the reason it's not a legitimate claim is because many of the facts in it are still in dispute, particularly the origins. How are you going to say evolution is true when you don't even have an explanation for the origin of life?
Chemical evolution.
Yeah, you can't. Yes, exactly. Like chemical evolution. There are all sorts of problems within evolution which don't disprove evolution, but don't entitle you to call it a fact. And you can call the theory of gravity a fact because we can make predictions with it. It explains everything that it applies to. And you can talk about theories of light and other things that are physical with no problem at all. But you can't call the so-called theory of evolution a fact when there are so many uncertainties and things that are not known about it. So in that regard, you will see people who will say, well, evolution's a fact. Well, some people who are listening to it who really don't know are thinking that the LUCA evolution is a fact when it really is not.
Yeah. No, I think that's something that people, if everyone's just kind of do a quick search on the internet, I know I've put up a few links on the YouTube side, at least, of to the reasons.org. Folks can see the book there, but also there's quite a few things there. They talk about this equivocation of terms, these multiple definitions of what the word evolution might mean. And once you kind of familiarize yourself, for most people, with those definitions, and the book does this as well. The book gets into some of these things in different chapters. And I know, Mark, in your chapter, you have some examples of that help illustrate these things as well. But when people get real familiar with those definitions, it gets really obvious when you're reading like a Dawkins type of book, because he does that a lot, where see this, moth changed from this to, this color to this color. That proves evolution. It's the fact, it's like, well, now you're using it to mean something else,
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And once you figure that out, it starts to get easier to pick those out. So I think people need to know there's a little bit of work to figure out what those different definitions are. But really, once you do that, the fallacies are pretty straightforward to spot. At least they get a little bit easier, on most levels.
Yeah. And the other problem with some of these fallacies is they end up rolling into having a bandwagon effect. In other words, people will start hearing it often enough, and they'll hear other people repeating it, and they'll jump on the bandwagon, and they'll just agree with it because other people are agreeing with it.
Yeah, like everybody who thinks Tom Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time, which we know is false because he's a cheater. But see, now I'll get comments.
You don't know way more about that than I do.
I do. I know everything about that, and I'm an authority on that. So I'm appealing to myself as the authority on that, and stop being a bandwagon, because I'm a hater when it comes to Tom Brady. But anyway, so I'm just trying to make people mad now, so that's all right. But no, you're right. It's like, when there's a team, I'm just by analogy though, when there's a team that's getting a lot of success, all of a sudden everybody becomes a fan. And then when they lose, it's like, oh, all of a sudden you realize, okay, there's only a real core of people who believe in that team. Everyone else just enjoys the sort of ride. And I think that can happen. It's a psychological thing. We do it in every part of life. So it's no shock that we do it in arguments, that are more significant than our sports teams, related to human origins and those sort of things. So I think people need to realize that it makes sense. What you're saying is that sort of that human part that we all know makes sense. That it applies here as well.
It does, and one of the things that we have to watch out with the bandwagon effect is it works. Bandwagon appeal or a bandwagon effect, they're not the same. One's a fallacy and the other one's a cognitive bias. The Christians fall into that the same way anybody else does. I mean, you go to your church, you hear your sermon, everybody believes the sermon, they walk out and they're all thinking the same thing, and nobody wants to question it because everybody else is thinking it. And so it tends to keep people from asking questions. And that's a very big problem. It's a very big problem in Christendom, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so happy for shows like this, where you're actually asking questions and allowing other people to ask questions.
Yeah.
Prevent that bandwagon effect. We shouldn't all be thinking something is true because everybody else thinks it's true.
Yeah, and I think everybody anybody who's been watching us long enough, we're doing the show, realizes, this is one of the reasons why we see this massive shift within the church in a variety of ethical and social issues, is because I think for the 30 years prior to that, you have a lot of people who are teaching things, but they're not really teaching them to any depth. And so for people to buy in, they just bought in because they thought everybody else bought in, but they never really had a true belief in certain aspects of Christian theology or ethics. They just sort of said, well, if everybody believes it, it must be true. And they never questioned more deeply than that. But when the culture shifted and they had a reason, oh, well, now it doesn't make sense for me to follow this bandwagon, they kind of switch. And I see we can see that effect culturally in so many places. So, and again, I say that because I don't want to get too off topic here, but just so that things you might have already looked into and studied, and you're concerned about these areas, that's exactly what Mark's talking about in this kind of thing. He's just applying it to this topic of evolution and creation. So these aren't things I think that are outside of what people already understand, sort of maybe intuitively, even that you're pointing out. They just need to learn how to apply that thinking to maybe a new area they haven't thought of before, right?
It occurred to me, when I first became a Christian, I was taught that the Earth was about 10,000 years old, and that all the animals that exist today all evolved from creatures that were on an ark that was around 10,000 years ago. And I thought that was the way it was. I thought it was true. And everybody around me believed the same thing. And so it was very easy to adopt that. And it wasn't until I ran into some problems with that I started questioning it. It wasn't easy to do because some of the people around me were pushing back, saying, well, everybody knows this is true. Why are you even questioning it? So it did have an effect, but ultimately I did not stay with that because I looked for myself and did some investigation, came to a different conclusion. But even I recognize how powerful that is for other people. Just look at all the people around me at the time who stuck with that because they were afraid to question it because, well, everybody else thinks this, so I guess it must be true. That effect, the psychology of that effect is incredibly powerful. And some of the tests, the psychological tests that have been done, the studies that have been done on that are remarkable. And we won't have to get too far astray in doing anything with that, but I do want to say that I have looked at some of those because I'm interested in why the fallacies actually work. Why does the bandwagon fallacy work so well? It works so well because we will, under certain circumstances, predictably, about 30 to 40% of the population, sometimes even higher than that, predictably go along with the herd, even when they know absolutely the herd is wrong. That's a frightening thought. The numbers can go up even higher than that. But the interesting thing is that once we start paying attention to that, we can combat it. And knowing that there's a fallacy and that there's a cognitive bias that we can be careful of helps us to insulate ourselves from that kind of a problem.
Yeah, for sure. Let's jump into another one real quick. Because I think there's at least one or two more maybe that we can get in before we have to close up here that might be helpful to folks. Again, everyone, just I'll throw the book up just in case you've forgotten here. We're talking about this book. Oh, and I should say, let me do it right now too, actually. So I'm going to be doing a giveaway on this book. This is a good time to drop it in. I've made a few comments about this and I've shared this on social media. We're doing a giveaway about thinking about evolution. And so if you would like your chance to get a copy of this book, the very copy I have in my little hands, then go ahead and leave a comment, make some sort of just comment. Let me know you're there. Say, I want the book, whatever it is. And I will do a drawing later for this. I'm also going to feature this on the blog at morethancake.org after. So if you want to go ahead and I'm going to just put up a link to that. But if you want to get a chance to win this book and kind of read it for yourself, a little more details on what we're talking about here, you have a chance to do that when you make a comment. So everyone, please feel free to go ahead and do that anytime. So there's a couple more things I wanted to jump in here on. Like I said, that you go into a little more detail in the book, and we won't cover all of those things, even in just your chapter. But let's look at, let's see, I have some of the ones I thought were here that were good. What about the one or the other fallacy that you call the one or the other fallacy? What's that one about? And maybe can you give an example of what that looks like?
Sure. The faulty dilemma or false dilemma is another name for that particular fallacy. And the way it works is you pose two options as if they're the only two options, and when there actually is a third option. So one of the things that you'll look at, and I've seen this, and we all actually have probably all seen this in evolution debates or evolution proponents critiquing creation theory, is they'll say, well, either you believe in science or you believe that the earth is 10,000 years old. So that's a false dilemma, because there are creation theorists who don't believe that the earth and universe are only 10,000 years old.
Yeah.
So that's an example of a faulty dilemma, and it occurs very frequently. And it's very useful because it plays off the ignorance of a lot of the members of the audience. Mm-hmm. And if you're part of an audience like that, it would be helpful to comment on that to other people and say, no, you know what, that's a false dilemma. It's not really either just this or that. There's a third option, or maybe even more.
Mm. Yeah, and I think even broader too. You get that with the same way. Either you believe the science or you believe, your Bible. Either you believe the science or you believe, you believe in God. Or I mean, they can be any number of either or options there that people pick, as if that these two things are somehow, again, the only options or irreconcilable to begin with. There's a lot of assumptions that are sort of built into those either or type options.
Yeah, and I think really one of the most important things for us to do is when we hear an either or, even if we don't know anything else about the subject, say, well, how do you know it's only those two? And just pose that as a question, because it can break open that false dilemma really quickly. And I've done that. I've asked, of course, that very question to people when I knew there was a false dilemma involved. So, well, yeah, there's some other things, but they're not worth talking about. Oh, well, I actually would like to talk about them. Please, let's talk about these other options, because we all want to have an open mind, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you see the faulty dilemma, that's the way to approach it.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's what people need to know. What about the bald assertion fallacy?
A bald assertion a bald assertion is a claim that has no merit to it, but it sounds like has merit. And one of the examples I gave was one of my favorite things to beat up on is evolutionary psychology. And I'm not the only one, by the way. There are people who are not Christians who love to use that as a football. And the problem with evolutionary psychology is that they make claims about how we got the emotions, the fears, etc., from evolution. So, for example, one of the things I talked about in the book was an example of people saying, well, the reason that we have these particular fears is it protected us when we were evolving in the wild. Well, they don't know that. They weren't there in the wild whenever this supposedly occurred. It's hard enough to understand how people have fears and different kinds of emotions today with 7 billion people in the world to examine. How in the world are you going to do that with people you've never even met? And how are you going to apply that in environments that you've never been in, that we
Yeah.
don't know anything about? So those kinds of claims that, for example, claims that are supposed to justify adultery. Well, men or women just need to reproduce, and that's this need for extramarital affairs is nothing more than a psychological need that evolution put into us to propagate the species.
Mm.
Okay, please tell me how you figured that out from anything in the history of the world. There's
Yeah.
no evidence for it. None. It's a bald assertion. It's just bogus. And you'll see this all the time with evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychology shows up a lot. It's almost like the Oprah show of the evolution fans. It's just constantly on and constantly talking about stuff that has no way to prove their bald assertions.
Yeah, it's funny that that does show up a lot. It's sort of the just so stories or the storytelling that kind of goes with this stuff that could almost cover anything, you know.
Yeah,
And if there's a problem or a challenge, somebody can just, well, they come up with a scenario. They say, well, maybe if, this person did this and then they thought this, then this had to evolve to do this, which is really odd because natural selection to be able to pick up and select for emotional responses seems a little bit odd, but considering it's not, it's a non-material property, would be kind of odd. But you know, the
well,
storytelling is
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. There's a big question of how natural selection would apply there at all, and what natural selection really does. But that's a big topic and
Yeah.
maybe fun sometime.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to go, go the whole way, but yeah, the evolutionary storytelling, the kind of has, and actually just on the psychology side, just as in itself, it's interesting because even in regular psychology now, there's a lot of uproar, just human psychology for living people, like you were talking about. Some 50% of studies that are done in psychology are can't be reproduced through second or third attempts to reproduce those studies. So there's
Yeah,
a big problem with in the last several years. There's been a huge retraction of a lot of the literature, a lot of studies. It's funny because there's a lot of studies that have been done that I've seen news articles on that get talked about all the time. Is, oh, did you know they did a study and it shows that this is why people gamble or whatever the issue is. But a lot
yeah.
of those studies have been retracted because they're just not verifiable. So, there's a huge question. This isn't a Christian versus psychology thing either, like you said. There's a lot of, secular secular scientists who question the scientific nature of psychology in and of itself, let alone now we can't even, like you said, we can't even do it for each other. And if I was a licensed psychologist and I tried to, psychoanalyze you based off a video clip, or without ever meeting you, or having had you in my presence to go through a like interview process, I could
Yeah.
lose my license or practice for improperly. Yeah, we do it with non-living creatures that lived supposedly millions of years ago. Like, well, he came out of the cave and he was scared, and oh, okay, is that?
Exactly. Exactly.
I
I
think
mean,
that's
you're
funny.
hitting right on the nose of the ball of assertion. And that
Yeah.
reproducibility crisis in the social sciences is a real problem because the news media will run with it like there's no tomorrow. And too many people see the news media as authoritative when it isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, let's see one last one real quick. I know you have several more in your book. But what about what's called the a priori? I saved this one for last because it has a little bit of Latin in it. I didn't want to scare anybody off with a Latin word. But the a priori fallacy of evolution. So maybe you need to tell us what a priori is first, but then what is the a priori fallacy of evolution?
Yeah, the a priori fallacy is the fallacy that assumes something to be true without it being tested, and then presuming that, using that presumption to found a theory. So in the case of evolution, for example. Uh, in some cases, the option of seeing God as a reasonable alternative to natural causes for natural effects is a priori or presumed not even capable of being considered. So that's an a priori fallacy. In other words, you haven't proved that God doesn't exist, yet you're excluding him as a possibility merely because you have this metaphysical presumption. And so that's the classic definition and a classic problem in much of evolution theory, particularly when they're trying to defend their abiogenesis. That we cannot look to see that God might have done this because we only work from natural causes and natural effects.
Yeah.
So that's an a priori fallacy.
Yeah. So it gets to, and just to be clear too, so people understand as well, we all have sort of a priori presuppositions. We can't function in life without some sort of a priori, presupposition. The question is, are we aware of those? And two, have we tested them? And do those a priori presuppositions allow for us to exclude certain things as possibilities or not? But in this case, for evolution, it just sort of is, yeah, well, we know God's not real, so therefore he can't be, called upon to explain anything or be connected with our science. Well, how do you know that? Well, because we know he's not real. It's just sort of like, again, a little circular there too, but
yes.
Yeah, it's that same kind of thinking that we have to be careful of, where God's excluded from the start. And if you say, well, I'm a Christian, well, you can't be, because this is where they get to that bold assertion. You can't be a Christian and a scientist because, God's already assumed to not exist. So therefore your faith has to be anti-science. And so all these kind of jump and muddle together at some point.
Yes. Yeah, that showed up a couple of weeks ago when you were talking about fuzz rana. It wasn't talked about that way, but it had to do with the philosophical versus non-philosophical methodological naturalism.
Yeah.
So that philosophical methodological naturalism is an a priori fallacy. You're taking that on without any evidence that that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's a real big one. Actually, a lot of theistic evolutionists sort of operate from that because they're trying to be, make an argument that they think will be persuasive to, non-believers. But in doing so, they're sort of saying, okay, I'll concede that God could never do this, X, Y, Z. And I'll concede that God isn't a part of the picture. And I'm just going to make it completely, it's like, okay, but now you've accepted that sort of a priori assumption that God isn't there. So what are we really arguing about at this point?
What if the weight of the evidence shows the contrary?
Yeah.
What are you going to do with that contrary evidence?
Yeah.
You're stuck. You've just blown up science.
Yeah. So yeah, you have to science, people, science has to, you have to look at those different theories that answer a question and eliminate those based on the evidence for each of those theories, not based on a presupposition ahead of time. Like, okay, you could just say, okay, what about aliens did it, or whatever the case may be? Well, fine, propose that as a theory. And maybe I don't believe in aliens, which I really don't, but okay, I'll take that, but let me show you why that doesn't match this. So I don't even need to eliminate aliens a priori ahead of time to invalidate somebody's theory. Something I can, if it's bad, I can poke holes in the theory to explain whatever circumstance without having to dismiss it out of hand. So if people have to dismiss it out of hand, it's probably because their argument's weaker than they really want to admit.
That's right. A theory either explains or predicts or describes something, some phenomenon. And if it does a better job than its competitors, then it's the better theory. That's all there is to it. There is no reason to exclude something a priori when a theory does at least as good a job predicting or explaining or characterizing phenomena as its competitor.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me ask this one last question, and then we'll kind of lead out on this one. And I'm going to sort of a softball here, but just kind of throw it out. Why should Christians bother with any of this at all? I mean, with this book, with your chapter, with any of these discussions, we've got a lot on our plates. All the world's crazy, all kinds of issues happening. Why should they bother with fallacies? Why does it even matter?
It matters because the way we think determines what we say and what judgments we make. And judgments can be judgments for Christ. Judgments can be judgments about how we're going to talk to somebody else, how we're going to live our life, etc. So when you can't make good judgments because your reasoning is defective, your life is a mess. It gets worse the worse your reasoning is. And if Christians really want to reach out to others and evangelize them and show them the love of Christ, they're going to need to be able to do it clearly, without fallacies, without trying to move somebody purely by an emotional or an alternative explanation rather than the facts. And the world is watching us, and they are critiquing us. And we should love the Lord with all our hearts, minds, and remember all our minds and strength. And part of that means when we're presenting our arguments, we need to do it clearly so that those who hear it will appreciate them fully. We want to present the truth clearly.
Yeah. And I think that's actually a really great point to close on for this, is that people need to realize that if we want to be effective at presenting the gospel, just even the gospel, even if the science side of stuff isn't our thing, or evolution or creation, those sort of things on our thing, learning these fallacies is pretty important, because just to be able to present the truth and the love of Christ, if to look at what love is and what it means and what love of God entails, people have all kinds of fallacies will creep in that they've chosen not to believe in God for those things. And so if we can't break through those things,
Exactly.
we're not going to be effective at presenting the truth. If for example, if I say, well, look, I showed Mark how much I love him, I bring him food, or I do nice things for him. But if Mark has been convinced that Christians only show kindness because they're selfish, or they have a quota of people they're supposed to talk to, or if you've been told a lie about why I'm showing kindness, my kindness isn't going to persuade anybody. Well, if I don't know enough to have a conversation and say, well, Mark, said, I was told that you either, you believe this about Christians or not, or some kind of. If I can't figure out how to point that out, I'm not going to break through those lies that you've been told.
That's right.
So people need to know this is pretty important for all those reasons. So I want to thank you, man. I'm going to show the book here one last time. It's on both sides here, but Thinking About Evolution, 25 questions Christians want answered. Again, I'm doing this as a giveaway. So if you're commenting on Twitter, on YouTube, we're in several places on Facebook right now. So if you're looking into these, if you want to get a copy of this and read Mark's chapter, or any other chapters, a lot of great contributors. Like I said, we had Fuzz run on last month, and Mark this month. But if you want to get a copy, comment, do whatever, and I will pick a winner, and I'll announce that on the social media stuff. But thank you again, Mark, for coming out and being a part of the show, and look forward to connect with everybody else next time. I'm going to try to do another show next month. I got another person I'm lining up for another little book discussion that we might have. So trying to get a little more regular. I'm in the middle of my PhD stuff here. And so trying to get the time to do all these shows has been a little crazy for me. But I'm trying to at least get back to once a month for a while, and then eventually every week. But God bless everybody. We'll talk to you soon, and pick up a copy wherever you buy stuff.